Right.
Yeah.
Zoom recording. There you go.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Housing Solutions Advisory Council meeting for September. We haven't met in a few months, but saw many of you at the listening sessions, either online or in person, which were incredibly effective. And I think a lot of good information came from them to ultimately help our system. And we do have BNF to thank for that. So thank you, BNF, for your time and energy and work on that, because it was well thought out and then executed really well. So appreciate it.
Good job. Good job.
We are going to jump right in because we do have a pretty robust agenda, and I'm hoping that Jess walks through the door in the next 180 seconds. We're going to move to public comments, either in person or online. So if anybody has any public comment. No, Meredith?
There's no one
No
from the
one?
public
Okay.
on. Yep.
Okay, great. So see how quickly we are doing this. Our next thing is our subcommittee updates. We will start with the performance evaluation technical subcommittee.
Yes, so we have 2 meetings since the last time we met, and our meeting on August 14th, we review a presentation of a monitoring on to the enhanced rapid rehousing SHS. This monitoring is how well partners are operating to the contractual standards, assistant performance or effectiveness of the system. It was a pilot also as well, and yeah, it was good to see how that's going to be implemented to other contracts in the county, other partners. And then we review the OECS MAC report. There was a concern identified about the staff retention after training, and the behavioral health issues that's happening with our homeless friends, and the need of that connection to the health system that is lacking at the moment. And on September 11th, we also had a presentation from HMIS implementation and Tri-County HMIS vendor RFP that is going to start. So the presentation was to letting us know that that is going to happen for the system that we currently use, and they will be looking for recommendations of who and what type of providers and also non-providers can provide feedback for a good fit for this process. And the subcommittee, there's going to be a subcommittee, homeless management implementation, HMIS, or the platform that we use to record our system. There will be a subcommittee, and yeah, there will be recommendation for who should be hired. And we'll review the Q4 report, the Q4 report, also the Housing 360 pilot and novel updates. There was no recommendation on this, so we also do not require any vote. That's it.
Thank you, Zoe. The next subcommittee is our Lived Experience Advisory Committee, and I think Nadia, maybe I'm going to ask you to speak to that. Oh, you're muted.
I'll be quick because I know we have a lot going on today. So for lived experience, we had a quick technical meeting where there is a HUD requirement that we have to send in a letter about the populations that we serve and the diversity around that, and that's what we worked on. And then next month we should be doing another meeting around coordinated entry. I also want to just quickly note that our the HUD NOFO is nearing its deadline, and so the Equitable Procurement Subcommittee will be meeting in the beginning of October to rank those applications. And then as Zoe was talking about with HMIS, we will be starting the HMIS technical subcommittee as well, because there are some changes that are going to come up with the HMIS software and things like that that will need to be reviewed. And so that you should hear updates on that sometime soon too.
Thank you, Nadia. Yes.
Is there a way to provide support for folks who are on the HMIS subcommittee? Just because we would like lots of participation from different users, but that is pretty technical. Is that, are they subject to the same kind of support that folks can get?
What do you mean by support?
Money.
Like to do with the lived experience.
Right. Yes, HMIS, not a.
Even if they're part of the, like the partner nonprofit.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Like, here's what I thought of as I was listening to this. I was like, oh yeah, that system. Ooh, okay, I really hope they get a chance to improve it. Oh boy, how many providers are willing to dedicate time to it? That was what was going through my mind. So I thought, oh, if I say maybe there should be support, then maybe more providers will be willing.
Question for Nadia.
Well, if there are folks that are interested in being part of the HMIS subcommittee or know other folks that would be a good fit for that, just pass them along to me. I'll send out these updates on email too, as reminders.
Thank you. Good question. Okay, our next agenda item is the SHS revenue constraints, and we have Jess Larson here to walk us through that presentation and conversation. And we're right on time, so
Yes,
it's great.
we are.
It's great.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, nice to see you all. We are, is there a presentation that we can load up? We are coming forward really quickly with information that's still emerging as we close out our fiscal year 3 and are already in the midst of, quarter 1 of year 4 with the supported housing services revenue. And there's some new emerging information and trends which are worth celebrating and also require significant planning and possible important adjustments, challenging adjustments. So I'm bringing this information forward. Well, it's today the 18th. 19th, and we submitted our report to Metro on the 30th. So the numbers were finalized while I was on vacation, and I came back, and we are now contending with what we know at this point in time, and planning for how we move forward, planfully, thoughtfully, responsibly with these important resources. Let me get you that information as much as we can. So I think the first slide is sort of like, let's celebrate, because actually it's the next slide. Thank you, whoever is helping direct us. Is that you, Meredith?
Nadia is helping
Nadia,
us.
thank you so much. Sorry. So the next slide is our celebration slide. We want to pause and recognize how much incredible work has been done across Washington County in the first 3 years of supported housing services revenue. So more than 10,000 people, 5,700 households have been touched with these dollars over those 3 years, many of them still being served in our housing programs today, having resolved. I wish I knew this number off the top of my head. I'm reviewing simultaneously, we're working on our annual report, and there was a really astounding number of I know what it was. The average length of homelessness for people who were housed last year, who were homeless and now are housed, had on average been homeless for 2.5 years. So just stunning to think about that change underway. So there's hundreds and hundreds of households who've been placed. I think that's the number there, 693 households placed into housing last year who were homeless. And then 1,500 households who were prevented experiencing homelessness with rent assistance to keep them in their homes. I think there's a few households included in there who got moved in quickly to stable housing also with some just moving costs, not ongoing services. And then 1,357 households or 1,828 people who've gone through one of our shelter programs or are still being served in our shelter program. So these resources have created a massive system that was not able to be provided here in Washington County, and every day is creating a safe place for someone to sleep and hopefully a much better home to raise family and children and create stability once again. So game-changing resources, we are so grateful, and we are going to continue to do this important, critical work. And the next slide, I think, takes us into sort of some of our realities of our funding. So what you see in the light green was the plan, and what you see in the dark green was the actual for last year, quarter by quarter. The plan is, we know every quarter we spend a little bit more because the staff person gets hired or the household gets housed. And so our costs go up pretty significantly across the programmatic year, especially while our system continues to grow. At a certain point, that's all going to level out or mostly level out quarter by quarter. But right now, while we're growing, we expect quarter by quarter expenditures to increase. And the plan went mostly according to plan last year. We spent a little bit more than planned every quarter and a lot more than planned in quarter 4. So we in fact had to adjust our budget in our last quarter, which was fine because you may recall that we have carryover funds. And some of those carryover funds were planned investments into shelter projects that are underway right now or other one-time important investments like eviction prevention. But what's significant about what we learned last year is what's changed in years 1 and 2 with our contracts with our providers. In years 1 and 2, we would put out a contract and the provider would spend 25% or 50% of that contract. And in year 3, our provider spent almost all of their contract, which is great. Again, success, progress. We're doing the work, spending the resources where we're planning to spend them. But what this means now is we've sort of reached that top bar of what we can afford to sustain year over year. So yes, go ahead, Jim.
Could you just give me a couple of comments on quarter 4?
A lot of that, and this happens almost every year and probably will continue to happen every year. It takes a lot of work to keep up with the billing with the contracts. And so providers get caught up in that last quarter because we have to close books. And so more invoices come in the last quarter. Plus, more people have been housed and more people have been hired. And so the costs are higher in that last quarter. So this is sort of the truing up of everybody's books and plus the accumulation of system growth over the quarter of the year. And so we'll probably see that a little bit of a bump every quarter going forward, but maybe not as much of a bump in quarter 4 because again, we're going to move into system sustaining and out of system growing.
So we can expect them that the expected things will gradually more approach what really happens.
Yes. So next year, you'll probably see that light green bar be bigger in Q4 than it was in Q3. Yes, good point. Was there another question? Okay. Well, the important point of this slide is just to say we spent all the resources that we budgeted for last year, which is a success. We had not done that yet. And also it brings to mind an important new approach in which when we put out contracts, we need to make sure we're going to be able to collect the resources for those contracts because now we can be assured our partners are going to spend those contracts, which is great. So it brings us to the next slide.
Jess, do you want questions along the way or was that way to the end?
It's up to you. We have a limited amount of time. I mean, I've said this, I'm doing 2 meetings at once, so I do have to walk out of the room at 2:40. But I'm happy to go either way.
I just on that, you were kind of deep in that point. So my question would be that for agencies that did not expend 100% of the contract, what we call leaving on the table in some ways, where did that funding go?
Sure. So let me say it differently. Our partners are spending a significantly higher percentage of their contract than they were in the first 2 years. Not everyone spent 100%. In fact, I think the 100% is us spending 100% of our budget, which is different than our providers spending 100% of their contracts.
Okay, I think that's a really good point, because like some of our contracts actually were decreased in a few areas because we weren't spending those areas, you know, to the full effect. So,
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense. Chair, can I make the recommendation of maybe just presenting for
Sure.
you, because we'll have her, and then we'll just have her for questions. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely. We can take our notes for
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, that was a helpful question. 100% of what we budgeted. And the other important thing I haven't been able to share yet is that this says, is likely to be lower than forecast. This is an old slide. We're moving fast here, everyone. The answer is we actually know now that we did receive less money last year than Metro had forecasted. And so for the first time in the supportive housing services revenue life, the forecast was higher than the actuals. Up until now, we've been hearing like, grow, we've got resources, get the resources out. And now, okay, we know that we're at the peak of what the SHS revenue is possible of creating. So both our partners being able to expand their contracts, plus the forecast now becoming a more real number, has caused us to go, okay, we need to be a little more conservative in how we approach our budget planning year over year. And this is happening today, September 18th, 19th, when we've already approved a budget, which is based on Metro's previous forecast, which is how we've been going about it. This is just we're doing well, we're planning and doing all at the same time. So we've approved a budget of 115 million based on a November 2023 forecast. And now we know that forecast seemed to have been a little bit high based on what we received at the end of last fiscal year. So the last point says program reductions may be necessary to protect us from overspending and protect the commitments that have been made in the carryover investments for things like shelter projects that are currently under construction. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and I think this is a slide with some specific numbers. So specifically, we received $6 million less than what's forecasted. So 6 million, and what was forecasted was 109.5, and then we received 103.5 in fiscal year 23-24. And as I mentioned, right now we are budgeting for 115. So right, we spent 196 last year. We have a budget for 115. We're growing at the same time. We're realizing our revenue might not be growing. So we're having this little pivot. And what our little pivot sounds like and feels like, again, 18 days and the understanding these realities with the actual dollars received. We have to wait until August 11th to finalize our budget because the revenues received from Metro in July and August are actually booked in the previous fiscal year. This is why this is happening right now. So what we believe we need to do is tighten our belt, figure things out right now. We do not want to overspend in our current program year, and plan for a much more conservative and sustainable program.
You guys can still see?
One moment. Can everybody hear us online? Because it just said it's muted.
Yeah, it just like blanked out for a moment.
Okay. And
Just
can you hear?
the room.
And you can hear it. Can you hear Jess? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. I have a comment that the sound was bad, but I wonder if it was because we were dropping out.
Okay.
You turn the presentation back on again. You're not projecting.
Maybe you can re-click that.
Yeah, I think I need to.
Yeah.
There we
Sure.
go.
Okay, great. Okay.
Do I need
Okay.
to start over or?
No, good.
Turn on my
So, are we good at home, Nadia? Are you able to hear me? Uh-oh.
Are you all seeing the system reduction needs?
Yep, we're exactly where we need to be. Can you hear us
Okay.
though? Okay,
Okay, next one.
no, this slide, please.
Okay.
I want to 99 million real quickly. Again, we're moving very quickly. This is new information, but when Metro projects, they project every year they forecast for the next 5 years. So they forecasted in November 109.5 for last year and 115 for this program year. That's why our budget is 115. But that forecast comes with a range of plus or minus $50 million for the whole system, not just us. So 99 million represents, if we didn't take the high end of their forecast, but we took a conservative lower range end of the forecast, we would instead have a budget of about $99 million a year. And that way we would be a lot less concerned about overspending and under-receiving. Because right now, we've been forecasting with the top end of their range, or we've been budgeting with the top end of their forecast, not with the lower end of the forecast. And now that we've reached this moment of, oh my gosh, we've actually collected less than was forecasted for the first time, we realize a more conservative approach is needed. So going forward into fiscal year 25-26, the staff will be recommending to the board when we meet with them next about this on October 15th, that we take that conservative approach in years going forward about with the forecast. And if we have collections above that amount, then we make those dollars available for the future program year. But we don't set ourselves up for the current program year to be sort of hoping that the dollars come in, which is where we're going to be at, frankly, throughout this calendar year. So that's where we're at right now. We think we're going to shrink as best we can, maybe delaying some programs, finding places where we can, our plan might have changed and we can realize some cost savings in the budget, hoping we're not going to have to reduce any contracts at this point. That's where we are right now. But we need to talk to our board, and then we also need to wait and see what the new forecast comes in, because again, this is based on, these numbers are all based on November 2023 forecast from Metro. We're likely to receive an update in November 2024, and we might be able to continue as planned. We might need to shift, pivot even more. But what we're going to be, and because budgeting happenings all year round, and this is where your role as our advisory bodies and so important in advising our work in our budgeting. We already know getting ready for next year that we need to take a more conservative. So I'm going to keep moving. This is a lot of information and framing, but hopefully it helps kind of orient us where we're at in this moment of planning. I think the next slide describes your role. And just as a reminder, your key role as our advisory body in this homeless system of care is providing us budgetary guidance, both in all of the homeless services investments that we receive, but also how we're leveraging them across the different resources and across other resources that might not be in our control, like Medicaid or other opportunities to leverage resources. So this is a key role as our advisory body is providing budgetary guidance. Our board has the deciding vote on our budget, right? They approve our budget, and staff's role is in the programmatic decisions with that budget approval from the board and the guidance received from our advisory body. The staff are the deciders. Molly, our leadership are the deciders on the actual programmatic details of action. But your role is advising us on the policies, the principles, that system balance, and these approaches that we're going to need to take to sort of manage these to manage these public resources all together effectively going forward. So just grounding you in your role. We're not asking you to decide programmatic budgets. We're asking you to advise us on the goal of the system, the balance, how conservative to be, where to find opportunities, what values to guide these decisions. So the next slide, I think, describes the questions we want to ask you, but I'm not going to ask them yet. I just want you to hold them while I finish up the slides, and then we'll come back to them. So as the system is rebalanced with these new financial realities before us, what programs should be held harmless to reductions? Think about programs at the big level: shelters, housing, case outreach workers, flexible funds, big system level, important, what important programs should be held harmless? And then, where are things that you would see that it would be appropriate for us to scale back first? And why? The why matters so much. We want to hear your whys. And then last, we would like for you to provide guiding principles on some draft, some feedback on these guiding principles. Yes, go ahead and go to the next slide, Nadia. So here is a draft of staff developed principles that we're holding and we think make sense for this rebalancing moment. So we need your guidance. Resources should remain focused on housing and maintaining housing for our priority populations, centering racial equity and ensuring that any reductions don't increase disparities in our community. Investment should be proportional so that people can move through the system from shelter to housing. We don't want to get people stuck in shelter waiting for housing, which is something we're already working through. Staying true to the commitments that we've made and prioritizing operational funds where capital investments have been made. We've got shelters underdeveloped right now. We want to make sure that those capital investments are operational. Balancing the quality of services with the quantity of placements. This is a constant balancing. We don't want to lose quality by maintaining quantity, but we also need to understand what the balance of quality is so that we can also have a responsiveness to the needs of our community. So that system sustainability plus person-centered. Considering the role of other public systems, leverage, right? Medicate. Figure this out. Our state partners, our federal advocacy, we must keep doing all of that as well. And maybe some like role clarity, making sure we don't creep too much into parts of the work that aren't our responsibility as the services system. And then managing as any reductions might need to be made next year and if necessary this year as well. Managing those impacts both to the partners and any participants of those programs by planning for ramp down periods and looking to the temporary programs that weren't that weren't necessarily meant to be sustained long term to help manage those impacts. Our last slide is just where we go from today. So as I mentioned, we don't have very much time today for discussion. We wanted to bring this information to you very quickly ahead of the October 15th conversation. We'll be getting a little more in depth with our board. And we're heading into budget season. So in many ways, this is just, it's a hard reality after so much growth and so much abundance and so much enthusiasm for what we've been able to build and wanting to keep building. A hard truth that we're pivoting away from building into balancing and system refinement. But it will be the work of this committee and of this staff going forward. These are our resources. We must sustain these programs. How do we do this best? Have the impacts on our community? We will need to continue getting that guidance from you. And we will be having this conversation, this specific conversation, and then the more global budget conversation with you every month. But I think Nicole wanted to write that, hold me accountable to be here specifically with you all monthly. So that's what that second bullet means. And then staff are working on those programmatic reductions, and we'll bring you any updates on any necessary steps that will be needed to be taken to prevent from overspending this year as more information and more clarity becomes available. I think that's the last slide. Okay, excellent. So if you want to go back to that question slide for us, Nadia, thank you. And then I'm here until 20 till, and just trying to go over to you, DNF and Nadia, or sorry, chair to facilitate the conversation.
I also brought printouts in case you wanted to have those copies here of just those thoughts. This is two-sided the question and then the notes in the back. I have one
the drafts yet.
I'm gonna leave a lot of space for you to ask the questions. So hopefully you've already read through this material and have some prepared questions for Jess, since we do have a limited time with her. But I do have a quick question, because this was a lot of information for us to get. And not everyone knew that we were gonna end up in this direction with the word reduction coming at us. My confusion is, it read that, you'll be presenting to the board on October 15th, and our next meeting is the 17th. So where is the feedback from this group going to be implemented? If there's-
Continuously, and yeah, continuously.
So what are you taking to the board on the 15th?
We're bringing to the board this, plus more specifics that are being developed around, that longer range fiscal year 25-26 budget planning. Some considerations around current restricted and reserved, funds that are required by the IGA that we can't tap into. And is there an opportunity for some political leadership to think about flexibility there? Or to plan for changing the way those are structured for longer term. And this idea that I was describing of, our proposal to staff that we're going to plan for the conservative range of the forecast, and then any overages help us with future years rather than more in where we're at right now, which is sort of the positive forecast and the risks that we're going to have to live in for the county. And we're going to get their support and direction around this new approach to budgeting, and the draft principles. So your draft principle feedback is going to go into what we share with our board. We're going to share with them what we hear from you today about what's untouchable, what's necessary, what's critical, and if we have to give, where do we need to give first?
And open up the floor for questions, and then we'll dive into the specific ones. But if you have any general questions from the information that's been presented, please.
I have a very silly one. The fiscal year is July through June.
Yeah.
Double check.
Yes.
I'm wondering the same thing.
With the caveat that the revenue year for supportive housing services is September through August. The expenditure year is still July to June. The revenue year is September through August.
Anyways, I'm gonna chime in where I can, just because I do know enough. So it's a really good question. It's not a silly question, because I think one of the recognitions we have to remember is the forecast for the budget was 115, and the reality is $108 million. So this current fiscal year, so the lot before June 30th, we need to find $7 million.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly how I would put this, because you do have the experience of contracts not being fully expended. And so that is where the board can have a little bit of, okay, we're willing to have a risk, we're willing to backfill, we're willing to do this kind of thing. So I do like the idea of the projection. You're going to use the midpoint projection. I wouldn't like you to use the lower projection though and create the continual uncertainty in the system. I think the middle seems like, okay, well, we're going to do something. But I also wonder if the board will consider, how does the system create something for this year? So did Metro take a cut as well? What is the, you just have to bring up those things. It's awkward, but where are the cuts going to be taken? Because if you have a provider facing contracts already out, that's the worst place to try to take the cut, right? And the best place is to try to take it behind the scenes in the administrative side. Not to say that that work is not important, or that it isn't what caused the system to be able to get to the point that I think it did, and it is important. But that framing that the system will become more stable is something that I think we should all lean into and be like, yes, we want it to be stable and predictable for providers, for participants, for folks who are served, for sure. And so in order to do that, we're going to make a one-time change in the rest of the infrastructure to try to make that happen this year. That's where I would go, but this is the hard part of being out of community. I like the snacks.
I was like, this is really, there's snacks.
I know. Why is it
Good job, Erin.
Two quick quick question. So, I haven't reviewed the Metro packet for next week, but just looking at it quickly, it doesn't seem like they're doom and gloom at this point. Okay, it seems like their revenue projections are pretty much where they expected. So I'm not objecting to taking a conservative approach, but it does sound like you are taking a conservative approach rather than a middle approach. And it certainly is good to have contingencies, but we do not want to be doing it. And the second question, which is kind of unrelated, is the status of the carryover funds.
Yes, thank you. And this is something that wasn't available or isn't here today, working on getting this ready for the October 15th presentation. Essentially they're committed and they are also a bit overextended. And the carryover changes. It's a point in time, right? It's what happens every August 31st when we close out our revenue books and look at what our final expenditures were and how much money can carry forward. And then we have to reestablish our reserves because our reserves are based on program revenue. And so everything sort of shifts once a year, and that's the carryover fund. And then we spend down from it as these capital commitments get launched, or we pay for eviction prevention or whatever it might be. And then we come back to the carryover next August and see where we're at. So right now where we're at this carryover point, and this hopefully. Thank you, Jim, for this question and relating it to the Monday presentation with the Oversight Committee. We'll work on getting this data for you all, and as soon as it's available, whether I can get it into the Monday presentation or the October 15th presentation, we'll make sure it's shared with you all. It is right now in the Metro reports that were sent out on August 31st, but it shows where those commitments are right now. We're using language of commitments and assigned, so things where the board has taken action and approved an access center, Project Wellness Connects Access Center, and Vernon's access center in Tigard. Those are commitments that we haven't written the checks yet, but the board has taken action and approved those funds. And then there are assigned commitments or assigned funding obligations from the carryover, where the board has provided direction to go forth and create these kinds of investments, but no official action or awards have been made yet. So that's what's in the carryover, along with some capacity building funding that is still going out to our providers from the first few years. So I believe the last year for capacity building funding, and then eviction prevention funding, which has been also made available through that carryover fund. And this will at this point, this is the last year for available funding for eviction prevention. So long answer, there is a carryover chart in the current reports that we've submitted to Metro, financial reports, not turned into a better looking PowerPoint for public consumption, but we'll work on that. And we are slightly overcommitted. I believe it is $7 million of that carryover balance that is beyond where the carryover commitments are. But that is like a 3 to 5 year plan. It's a 3-year plan that is constantly changing based on the revenue that's actually received. So frankly, to clarify, we're looking at finding ways to get to the middle path for this year and a conservative path for future years. And part of the middle path plan is using carryover funds, even though they've been overcommitted, but using them to stave off that hit and hope for future years where we can build back up that carryover fund. So.
Chair, we're at 2:40, just doing a time check.
More questions.
We do have the room reserved after 3 o'clock, so if people still have thoughts, comments, we can have the room for that.
I'd like to say if there's any feedback, I've been able to help receive questions, but it's really important to receive feedback today.
I guess it seems like, as you pointed out, that you're going to the board before we've had no discussion about the things that you're going to the board with. And are there some things that have been decided that would be good for us to know as you go to the board?
What's here in the packet, that the kind of the reality, the middle path, the longer term future path, and not decided,
staff recommendations under development. We'll get you out, I'll work with the team to get you out that carryover budget that we shared with in the Metro report. So you can see that plan as it's drafted and the draft principles.
I just have to second Kim and Jim as well. I think it would be really beneficial for all of us to meet before the meeting, just so that we can get all of our thoughts put together and give you the feedback that I think we all kind of want to give you.
I just wanted to share, Bella and I met with a group of McKinney-Vento liaisons and community partners this morning that really focus on the transition-aged youth population and also the school-aged youth and families. And we kind of held a little bit of a listening session and posed some of the same questions that we did at the community listening sessions and the one at Hisson as well. And the priorities that they relayed to us that I wanted to share to you all was really the services that get people off the streets, specifically youth and families. And so making sure that I think that is what I heard from them this morning, that would be something that we would hopefully be held harmless as those services that are specifically getting folks off of the street. And I think also something that I heard this morning from them was it seems like there is maybe still some strain and bottleneck in the system. And that any services that are supporting that will be held harmless as well. Like moving through phase 1 assessments and the community connect supports and those sorts of systems too.
When you said when you said that there's staff recommendations, are those recommendations informed by data of the programming and stuff that have happened during this 2 years? And then checking those bottlenecks and then inform based on that, make those recommendations as well?
Using data. Yes, and I also take this as feedback, like making sure that data is informing the decisions.
I was also just wondering, I don't know if this is feedback or a question that may not have time for an answer, but if there's any notice of funding maybe that is out there that hasn't been awarded that we could maybe rethink of whether or not it needs to be awarded right now, if it hasn't already been done.
The answer is yes. There is a transitional housing note for up to 30 million, which one-time capital funds, right? But that is a space.
I mean, I think, like, as I have experience with sitting down with families and making that phone call, that very first phone call to Community Connect, and understanding that there has to be a system, right? I mean, it's not good for the squeaky wheel to get the grease, or whatever you say that, right? There has to be a system in which a family has to be able to call it the bottleneck, right? It's like that filter system. I will say that sitting through that experience with multiple families, it's not my favorite, but I understand the reason why, and I understand that there are issues, with it. But I think taking that funding away from figuring that system out somehow, make it better, would make our lives that are working with people that are in the situation to get them into that phase 1, would make it so much easier for these people, and really pouring into that at the same time as the time gap between someone making that first phone call when they actually get housed needs to be a priority. And on the other end, housing systems or shelters that have success rates of putting people into housing situations that are successful, those programs should be supported. Because if they're doing it well, then gosh darn it, we need to learn and support them more. So it's like, take something that's winning and give it more. Does that make sense? So it's the two that I think should be held harmless.
You say the two, I actually took 4 things down that you're
And
saying.
take 4 things. Take 4 things. I like it. Take it all.
Okay.
No, I'm from the first phone call, that time gap, whatever services are provided there with Community Connect. And then at the end of the day, whether it be the voucher program, the shelter programs that are successful in transitioning someone into long-term housing, they're doing something right, give them more money. I don't know if that makes sense.
To add on, just the meeting that Drew was talking about, which is actually like, it's, I guess you could call it a leftover from the old continuum of care and the road home. But it's a quarterly meeting that we have with all the liaisons as well as community partners that specifically work with like youth. And we've seen so much of that where like, you know, we as liaisons working at the school system, we get families that are, you know, staying in their car or, you know, staying in the garage of a relative or something. And, you know, the first thing that we offer is like, okay, well, have you tried calling Community Connect? Have you tried this organization? And the vast majority of them are like on their wait list. They've been there for weeks and months. And so just adding to that, just additional supports for that system would be much appreciated, and or maintaining that support system would be much appreciated.
And maybe a revamp of it, if that's like additional, like if it's not working, then maybe we need to look at how to do it differently, but staying within the same model. I don't wanna have to go call 17 of y'all's organizations, my housing. I've done that. I don't wanna do that for someone. I mean, it's so much better to call Community Connect. It's just, I wish that.
It's not like
Hey,
rebuilding.
I just wanna pause really quickly. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
It's just about 2:50, and I wanted to
I was
know,
gonna-
I just wanted to do a pulse check. I know, Jess, you have a commitment, and we, like Bianna has pointed out, we do have the space until 3:30. How many folks can stay or plan on staying? Because we do also have the other presenters who are here, and I'm just, can someone tell me how many that is?
There's quite a few.
There's a few,
Yeah.
So I guess my last question, and this will be for you, Jess, is would it be reasonable for us to ask to see what's gonna be presented to the board on the 15th ahead of time?
Oh, absolutely. And they're public documents and, yep, we can confirm.
Ahead of
And-
time that we could then have space to potentially meet around it? I mean, so I'm asking if, could it be?
I see. So the materials are usually available, a week before presentation to the board. So what we could do is see if there's a time to convene.
Nadia said that we could.
Nadia thought
Yeah,
so?
yeah.
Okay.
Great, perfect.
Can the
Thank you.
chair confirm that is something that we can do?
Yes, that is something
Okay.
we would like to do.
Yes. Great.
I will leave that. Okay, thank you, Jess Larson, for being here
You're
and
welcome.
explaining
Thank
to
you,
us.
everyone.
Yes.
We're gonna really need you and your continued guidance and support along the way as we find this new balance and this new path of sustaining the system rather than building the system.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Eva, we apologize for the wait. But we are excited to hear from you and learn more if you are available and ready.
Well, just to confirm, because it sounded like some of y'all preferred October. Is that what?
So there was a conversation of having the documents be like reviewed and hopefully having a meeting prior to the board of directors meeting.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Correct.
All right, so I guess the part here then is, should we move this part of the presentation to October, or does everyone feel like they can give some focused attention to Eva and Shannon?
A question for the group.
So is the question, are we gonna ask Eva and Shannon to come back? Is that the question on the table?
Yes, that's what they were checking in on too. was whether it made sense to move it, because I think like they want a good like 20, 30 minutes. Is that right, Eva?
Yeah, if we could have 20 or 30 minutes, that would be what we're hoping for, to be able to get some good feedback and discussion from you all. And I'm also recognizing that this is kind of the end of the time that you had previously scheduled for this.
Are you guys available on that date in October? It's the 17th, I believe, of October at our 2 o'clock meeting time.
I'm looking at our calendar right now and it looks like we would be able to make that work.
Yeah, I'd be
Okay,
available.
well, we would really deeply appreciate that. And we thank you for your flexibility around that, because we do want to give you the time and energy that you deserve, and we want to hear your presentation. I'm gonna be a little crass, and I actually asked to move this agenda item because I knew that the first agenda item was gonna be robust. So let's just call that what that is. But we really appreciate, Shannon and Eva, your flexibility. So we will then see you at our October meeting, ready to commit 20 to 25 minutes to you guys and be attentive.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much for the time on your agenda. It sounds like you have a lot of other things going on. So we appreciate the time next month. So thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, you guys. So I am gonna do a pulse check because it is 2:50, whatever, 4. And I know some people either have to leave at 3 o'clock or get off at 3 o'clock. And some people are willing to stay for a little bit. Do we go ahead and take that break now? And those that can stay will stick around, and those that can't will be excused. Does anybody online or in the room as well have any last minute thoughts that they would like to speak into before they have to leave, if they have to leave?
Well, I would just like to ask, I do have to leave because I do have another meeting, but how can I circle back with what you all come to from the extended meeting that will take place today to get some of the feedback from that?
I got you, Vernon.
Hey, it stays recorded.
And it stays recorded, and we're public, but I got you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll continue the recording.
Yeah.
Are we taking a 2-minute breather? Or?
Yeah, I mean, let's get it pulsed here. Is everybody staying? Or do we have people that do need to leave?
Going to get a cookie.
Seems like
Do we need a potty break, what do they call it now, bio break?
Bio
Do you need a bio break?
Snack break.
Snack break, okay, let's go ahead and do that, let's go ahead and take about a 3-minute break. Excuse yourself if you need to, and if not, then we'll come back together. Great. Pause. Figure out a start, ooh, thank you, Meredith, I apologize, I didn't give you a heads up, I'm sorry about that. Catherine,
Yes,
I don't know if you have this answer, but we're gonna ask it. Jim is privy to some extra stuff because of his, appointment over there. And he's saying it looks like we have $115 million of carryover. What is that, what is carryover committed to? Like, what is that? Do you know? If you don't, that's okay.
I don't, and we can get the answer, but I think that's part of what's in the presentation that Jess was mentioning, that Jess went to Metro or is going to for Monday.
Okay.
That this is for Monday's meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, so you'll be there.
Yeah, we just didn't know what that was tied to.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So the question, just to make sure I got it right, is what is the 115?
What is the carryover tied to?
She did mention it. There's
Yeah.
2 different buckets. One is authorized, one is assigned. The 2 access centers are in there, and then things that the board has authorized is in there as well. But I can't say the project in particular.
Thank you. Drew, I overheard that you have to leave in 15 minutes, so if you have anything you want to start with, it could go to you, or the floor is open.
No, I think I shared my priority that I wanted to make sure that I just voiced some of the information we got from this morning's meeting, of just making sure that we're prioritizing the services, getting people off of the streets, and that I think encompasses outreach, shelter, the Community Connect Pro. I mean, I think, I don't know that that's a specific prioritization, but I think it's probably the first half of the system. Kind of prioritizing getting people out inside. And all the sports services that do that. I would say that from this morning, that's what I heard should be left untouched.
Great, awesome, thank you.
So I have the impression that permanent supportive housing and the long-term rental assistance associated with that is also dedicated. Is that by definition untouchable?
Well,
I know, I know, what I'm asking.
I got goldfish.
I know, I see. We have a specific target number of like how permanent supportive housing opportunities that we're committed to in the local implementation plan. So anything beyond that would be in theory potentially on the table unless we identified it as sacred.
And then wouldn't a nuance to it is we own those buildings?
We do not own, no, the PSH includes.
Oh, you're right, sorry, I wasn't going there.
Site
Faster, Kim.
based and scatter site as well.
Is anybody willing to speak into which could be considered for reductions? And if the answer is none, that's an okay answer as well.
Well, I'd like to think that nobody is experiencing difficulty anymore now that things have gotten so good and nobody's coming into the system, so you don't really need, shelter beds in transition, isn't that right? Because everything is so good.
Yeah. Welcome, Jim. I have
One of the-
waterfront property.
Did anybody else look at this back? One of the really confusing questions I had about the slide that is not coming. From the presentation that wasn't coming, is about, see if I can find it, about housing availability per income. And when you look at, I need explanation on this. So when you look at the very low income people, there are lots of very low income people and there's very low housing. When you look at the middle income on that slide that we didn't see, there's this many people and there's this much housing. Is that right? I mean, is there that much housing here?
Yeah. If you can pay,
Well, there's someone to pay, but
if you can pay 3,000 a month, no problem.
First, last, and first. First, last, and they're doing whatever they please to
Yeah.
get you in.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of the value of the strategy that allows scattered site or tenant-based assistance is that makes those units affordable for people at 0 to 30% area median. The subsidy does.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious how at the end of the day, I mean, I know they're gonna take our information and our suggestions and feedback, but how are the decisions going to be made? I mean, those are, I guess maybe that's the question. How is a decision of reduction really gonna be made? Is it gonna come from a commitment that's already out there? Or is it gonna come from, I think the question I posed earlier is maybe funding announcements that haven't been awarded yet? Because that seems like an obvious thing to me we just maybe wouldn't move forward with the funding announcement that hasn't been awarded yet, because you're not necessarily taking away anything from somebody that's been committed. But I don't know if it's all the same bucket.
At the end of the day, it's all the same bucket, right? The bucket's named Metro.
If it is,
How
then
we
yeah, then it would be the
siloed
same
it
bucket, yeah.
is then within SHS.
Because if that's $30 million, then that's $30 million. But it hasn't been committed yet, has it?
No, it's still in a no.
Right. I 100% know it's not that easy, or else we wouldn't be having that conversation, this conversation, but something to think about.
Yeah, no, I mean, my brain goes there too, right? If I take a step back and go, okay, pea brain, 3rd grade math, and take my numbers, which are up there, right? And go, okay, so over a 2-year period, we need $16 million, the 7 million and then the 9 million. And we have a $30 million NOFO.
you can still do a $14 million transitional NOFO. And I have no idea what's actually been submitted, because it was up to 30 million. So somebody could have come in with an offer of, hey, we're gonna do this number of units for this price, and it could be well under the 30 million. But again, that's not being in the weeds and not fully understanding how it all does play out. That's just my little pea brain going, easy math right here. But I'm getting the sense that it's not that easy.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate around us getting some information before it's being presented to the board. Because it was publicly announced to the board that we are seeing this information, and so we want to make sure that we do have some input. Whatever that looks like.
To answer your question, I don't think anything should go.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. I also think that, okay, so I'm gonna speak on the mental health side of things. There is let's just say that there's a large connection between houselessness and mental health needs. And if we are not serving our people with mental health needs, and we are not working with them through the transition of houselessness to what it means to be with a house or shelter of some kind, and not serving or meeting their mental health needs, those individuals are not going to be as successful in housing. And that is a large percentage of our houseless population. And they're on repeat, right? This is a cycle for them. So let's stop that cycle and really meet their mental health needs. So whether that be finding additional funding through federal, state, whatever, and partner with mental health agencies and organizations to be able to meet those needs. And I think the services will be more successful and possibly, actually do a better plateau of getting people off the street. Because it's a cycle and it's not gonna end until we meet those mental health needs. It's always that thing in the room that nobody really wants to talk about.
Well, I'm gonna tag addictions to it, right? So the addictions and mental health
100%.
services,
Yes, I
because
would
we're
agree.
putting people into housing and not
Correct.
giving them the wraparound services that they need,
Correct.
wherever that lies, or in tandem.
Yep.
Which is its own, I can only speak from my experience, so this is truly from my experience, is what I've at least heard, or at least to my understanding, is the way the measure was written. It doesn't allow for like SHS funding to go towards that gap. So you're correct, it's looking for state or federal funding to try to meet that need, but I think that is just, we need to get louder around it, because we're seeing it consistently. And I mean, something that I can speak to that we're seeing, and you and I have talked about this, and it kind of goes back to this addiction mental health piece, not having those wraparound services, is an easy scenario of our clients get their utility bill checks, they are to them, they get them, and then they don't use them wisely. So they're not actually paying the utilities, but then SHS is coming in paying the utilities. So we're overspending in this arena because people aren't capable of actually doing that piece. And we don't have answers. I don't have an answer for Catherine to tell her like, this is what we should do. It's a very difficult one, but it does cause me to get heightened when we're talking about a reduction anywhere. We go, hold on a sec, I know that we're spending, for 400 and whatever clients that we've housed. This is an ongoing piece of it. And so I think there's just so much to it, those little nuances that come into play. You asked a question at the last meeting, which at this point was 2 months ago, around how long are people staying, on a wait list in the system? What is that timeline? And I've asked for that again. I don't think we've received that answer. And it's gonna be depressing.
I'm telling you it is.
Yeah, exactly. You're not gonna enjoy
Every
joy.
day, and I want you guys
And
to
we
see
all,
it.
and we all need to know that.
Correct,
We
correct.
need to know that.
I can be it, but.
Yeah. And so back to your point around, we need, in some ways, we need community connect, because we need that point of contact to be able to connect people. And then, you know, how do we restructure maybe so that we don't have people just sitting on a wait list for X length of time, so.
I agree with you, and also, you know, part of the clients being the ones who have to call and check in.
Right.
And then if they're not calling and checking in every day sometime, because, you know, maybe if I insist, I'll get up on the line. It's not working.
Yeah.
And I think one of the patterns that was talked about during the meeting in the morning was, it's a cycle, like if you just keep on making them call and then they fall back to the bottom of the list, they're just gonna keep on ending up at the same spot. So I especially see it with my clients, they return to their abusers because they don't wanna be out on the streets. And then here we see them again 3 months later in the same situation. Mental health, addiction, it all comes into play with these situations. And us having just one system here in Washington County where the bottleneck system, people get lost in that system. People are having to call once a week or once a month, whatever the rule is right now.
Yeah.
And one of the thoughts that was put out during the liaison meeting or the McKinney-Vento meeting was having a housing coordinator or having one designated in Washington County or multiple in Washington County as well, so people don't fall through the cracks.
Yep.
I do have to step out, but I just wanted to say, I appreciate this conversation. Y'all are such great representatives for the people that you're serving, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and excited for what's to come from y'all's conversations. But yeah, thanks for.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vienna. Thank you for helping.
Yeah.
Sending you all the information.
Yeah, and Nadia's gonna share some housing stuff on my part, so watch out for that.
Yeah, I look for overalls. Me too. I do want to bring up, Stacy, a comment you made that I think is really important. And I'm not gonna get the full sentence, but something to the effect around the experience of contracts not being used 100%. So we know that, you know, which ties into then Jim's comment about, well, I'm looking at Metro's number and maybe this isn't gloom, you know, gloom and, what did you say?
Doom and gloom.
Doom and gloom, thank you. You know, and so maybe we don't have to be as reactive as we thought. I say gently, but I do think that's a really excellent point, because we left just over $600,000 on the table. It's not the right term, but at the end of the year, and then we did have some reductions in our contracts for good reason. I'm not, and so are we, you know, really at that 100%? And is there a little wiggle room to not be as scared or fearful in the moment?
You should have that wiggle room, right? So just go back to one thing that I think there might be a recommendation for all of us about this is, you know, we're gonna be trapped in this funding thing for like, well, for me, the rest of my life, right? We were talking about this, but Medicaid funding could be an answer to a lot of this. And one of the recommendations is whoever is pushing for Medicaid funding, because Medicaid funding could fund those two things that we're not able to fund from SHS. So I think we're gonna have to, I think we would have a recommendation to say, whatever sources of funding we could look at outside of this, we should be vigorously pursuing.
And we should, and it's a really good point. And I think that with our agency, this conversation and a few others earlier on have made us go, oh, hold on a second. We're just kind of comfortable that SHS is the answer when that is not actually where we should be living. And as soon as we stopped that and broadened our horizon, we found other resources to be able to shift. If someone was ready to get clean and sober, there are some resources out there for that. And that piece was really, really helpful for us. And so, yes, and we'll see what Medicaid, I haven't in it a little bit, scares me. So I haven't dove too far into it, but yes, that could be a potential place to talk about these major gaps.
So in the guiding principles, it says, consider the role of other public systems. I think we should just call out the ones that you have been thinking about, right? Medicaid is the obvious one. And then something about what you said, the capacity of providers to like manage the different funding sources and to say like, okay, we're not gonna build a system that's so responsive to one funding source
Right.
that when that falters a little bit, the
Right.
system falters, right?
Right.
And so I think that's
That's
the,
it.
you know,
I like
like
that.
kind of recognize
Yeah.
the work of the system is to be, you know,
Yeah.
whatever word you wanna
Resourceful.
use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Buffered.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I
Yeah.
think part of our role, you know, when it talked about our role here, and then we see these guiding principles is to make sure that we're holding ourselves to accountable to these. And so looking at, you know, maintaining housing for the priority population, that central center of racial equity piece, you know, like you know.
And then on that,
Mhm.
that we have, you know, promise to be aligned to is the data. Where is the data? It's been 2 years. Where's the data of people calling Community Connect, phase 1 assessment, the ones we're checking in? Are we looking into demographics? Who is entering housing? Who is going back to homelessness? What is the support that they need? Why they go back to homelessness? So then I can feel a little bit better to inform this is the part of the system that maybe, you know, we can let go and let's hold into that. Because if you ask me right now, everything outreach, Community Connect, case management, shelters, everything is crucial.
I was literally thinking the same thing, I'm like, I don't know what.
Oh, you asking the wrong person? Everything is important to me. Don't let go, eviction prevention, don't let go anything.
I will say I have one besides figuring out Community Connect and that bottleneck, right? Key important piece that we have to continue to work on. I do have one shift that came out of some conversations and then internal conversations as well, is we have rapid rehousing within our, you know, our housing program stuff. And it's an interesting program. We didn't do it well at the beginning. I'm gonna use we statements here. We didn't do it well at the beginning, so now we're bumping up into some issues and stuff. And we had a conversation, and what came out of that conversation is, you know, if you actually looked at it as transitional housing, and literally lights on for my staff and I, we were like, yeah, that's right. That's exactly how we can look at it, which means then we, you know, intake someone in a different way and we move them through the timeline, because it's a short term, right? Rapid housing is short term. In a different way. We make sure that we are looking at the other systems that are out there to transition them, you know. So when we talk about the $30 million NOFO for transitional housing, what'd you say? I know, does that sound familiar? That's weird, right? When we talk about the $30 million NOFO for transitional housing, yeah, you know, you flinch when the suggestion is like, well, that hasn't been awarded. That's not even a completed NOFO. Like, maybe we look at that. I get more comfortable because I can tell you that in some ways we're already funding transitional housing. It's just called something different right now. And that's where I get myself in trouble, by the way.
Yeah.
That and a multitude of things.
Good point.
I'm just.
And I'm gonna add that if we add the mental health support and the prevention of addiction stuff, that is the transition.
Yep.
Make that rapid housing successful. Because we think of transitional housing as a solution for that population that the case manager that doesn't have the mental health
correct
can support our clients effectively. So transitional housing may be the solution, you know.
Yeah. And then I will just say, for your sakes, the other thing that I've at least brought to the attention of leadership at the county is, and I'm happy to be transparent about it because it's just a truth. Our shelter contract is a fee-for-service shelter contract. And it really has allowed us to have autonomy about how we spend our money and what we need to do. And one of the shifts that we decided to make because of that contract being fee-for-service is we did an in-house peer mentor program. We recognized that we were putting people into housing without the wraparound services. And we were like, what are we gonna do? And so we were like, okay, I guess one of the things we can do that we know is a successful model is peer support, peer mentorship. So we've started building this program so that we have folks having those touch points with people we put into housing. Our goal would be to have them at housing, shelter, and access center at some point. It's a big goal and we're excited about it. But without those appropriate wraparound services, you gotta have someone else making sure that people are connected. And we also know that sometimes folks, once relationships are built with those peer mentors, can help drive to the appropriate services. And so one of the things that I've at least put on the table and could be a community ask is more fee-for-service contracts. The ability to make our own decisions within some stuff. I recognize there's some programs where that's just not possible, and I'm really comfortable with that. But I do think there's a few programs, outreach would be an easy one, right? Throw that out there. That could be fee-for-service, allow the agencies to have that ability to make some decisions for the sake of the system and be able to move forward in a positive way. We've had a positive experience because of it. Like I said, we were able to rethink it a little bit and shift to a peer mentor program utilizing those shelter funds. And we've only seen good. Not perfect, because when someone is ready for detox and you take them to detox without an appropriate exit plan, not great. Again, resources aren't available.
I actually want to say like that has worked also for our shelters,
Yeah.
just us having more autonomy over who comes in and like the whole process behind it, and we've only seen positive things off of that too. So we actually had people being employed for over a year and not returning back to the cycle as well.
Nice.
So it's actually worked out a lot better for us. There's still the scatter sites that are under the county, but yeah, we're having issues with that, but yeah.
There's a few of us that joke, so when, back in COVID days, and you all know that, you know, we were just thrown, I mean, that was a lot of money coming at us, right? We were just throwing money and no policies and procedures were in place, so it was a get stuff done type moment. Normally I wouldn't use the word stuff, and right, I am on recording. My children would say it's a bad word, and I'm always, and I actually said this to Jess recently, and I was like, just give us the money and let us do it. I promise we'll have success, just, you know. But, okay, so I will work with Nadia and Meredith, around, so if things are due a week before the county commissioner meeting, that would be the Tuesday previous to that meeting. Whatever, the 8th would be that date. And then we might have to call a special meeting, and it could be over Zoom if we need it to be, if in person is too difficult, which I know it can be sometimes, to come together and look at the recommendations that are being put forward and make sure that we have some feedback and input on that.
What's the requirement for length of time to call a special meeting for public notice?
We will look.
Good question.
Yeah. And then I think the next follow-up question, which you don't have to answer now, is that agenda is going to be set. By the time we get it, it's going to be to the commissioners in public, correct? And so our decision isn't, we can give feedback, but our decision, I'm not just.
We're not a decision-making body.
Well, we're not a decision-making body, but we are a council of this county. And if we fully disagree with the recommendations being presented, we could say that publicly.
Good.
Is what I was trying to say.
You were really great at speaking.
That's very kind of you. I'm really passionate about the people we serve. And if you wanna put them in jeopardy, I'm gonna insert myself in a big way. And then I try not to cuss flawlessly. Oh, this morning I met with the city of Hillsborough and all I did was cry, so.
We didn't do that until this afternoon, so when?
Nadia's like, all right, I'll come back on camera now.
So we will, yeah, so Nadia, I will follow up with you to figure out next steps and when we might have to.
Yeah, I was gonna quickly say, if we have an idea of like what date works well for everybody, like are Thursdays again, like a good one, or a different time and date?
I will help you, Nadia.
Okay.
I'm not gonna just focus on you. I will help you we'll get a pulse, we'll figure this out and we'll figure out a date and I will be your girl for this.
Okay, and then the other part of this is we did have some announcements. Like I know everyone's leaving. so I am going to email them. They are technically like a briefing is in the agenda, so it shouldn't be like a big surprise what it is.
Sorry, Nadia.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. So the meeting is adjourned, but we will look for those updates.
I'm out of town.